I'd like to bring your attention to your attention. You're likely already at least vaguely aware of it every day. Every time you decide whether or not to swipe, scroll, or skip ahead. Every time you decide whether or not to actually finish reading the article. Every time you decide whether to turn the page or put the book down. Whether to keep listening or to zone out. Or if you're old school, whether or not to change the channel or the radio station. Every day you're making hundreds of tiny judgment calls, however consciously, about whether or not this video or that person or this subject matter is worth your time, in however shallow or deep a way you define that in the moment. Or maybe you're more than vaguely aware of your attention. Maybe you're horrified by the reports of young people who lack the ability to read books, who've never read a book, and are not likely to read one in the future because why would they? Maybe you're outraged by the companies that are manipulating, harvesting, and selling our attention to the highest bidder. Maybe you feel frustrated and hopeless about it. Maybe you struggle with your attention like it's a demon, but you've noticed that it seems like the demon is taking over the world, not just your life. And why would you be strong enough to beat it in a wrestling match? The way I've been talking about attention here is the way in which we generally talk about it these days, as something we have very little of, less and less every day it seems, something that is either held or not held by an outside object, as something to protect and gain mastery over, a discipline we're either proud to have or ashamed not to have. It's something we worry about, but feel powerless to change. It's something we measure in spans. But attention is so much broader and more beautiful a topic than our anxiety-ridden hand-wringing would allow. Attention is a quality of experience, not just some laser beam we operate through sheer willpower. Attention is how we cultivate a rich inner life. It's an attitude, a posture. It's a form of prayer, a door to transcendence. Speaking out of my own personal experience and drawing on the wisdom of a few of my favorite thinkers, both living and dead, I want to expand our collective horizons a bit in how we think about attention, to give us some different metaphors with which to talk about it. And I promise it'll be interesting. Although that's kind of on you, as we shall see. I'm Ellen Riccio, and this is First Creatures. First, let me tell you what this is not going to be. This is not going to be a scientific survey on the subject of attention. It won't be a summary of all the latest research and theories about how our brains are wired. There will be no shocking statistics. It's not even really a self-help guide, except perhaps in the broadest sense, in the sense that it can be very helpful to just read what great minds have written. Doing so is often clarifying and inspiring. It gives us language for an experience, which helps us to think about it more deeply and reflect on it more honestly. But yeah, I'm not going to give you a bunch of facts and figures or a step-by-step plan for how to get your brain back, as it were, because I just have this feeling that we're not going to be able to inform our way out of having a dulled mind. I don't think we can muscle our way into paying attention either, and I definitely don't think we can shame ourselves into it. So what follows is not the message of an alarmist, even though I do think it's worth sounding the alarm about this. I just think that being alarmed about our inability to concentrate is surely not going to help us concentrate. So here's what I suggest instead, and what I hope to offer today: an invitation. A warm, kindly invitation to a sweeter, sharper state of mind. I think that in order to find or increase our capacity for attention, we need our imaginations to be activated. Perhaps all we need is one small suggestion of what attention can be, what it feels like, what it can become. And perhaps our curiosity will lead us from there. A good place to start when looking for a nudge in the right direction is art and poetry. Poets and artists are all about paying attention to what they see and hear around them and to what they feel in their bodies. In writing poetry and making art, they help us locate feelings within ourselves and to see our environment with new eyes. Susan Sontag wrote that the history of the arts is tantamount to the discovery and formulation of a repertory of objects on which to lavish attention. What a great sentence. What a great mind. Susan Sontag once said she felt that she had been endowed with an almost inexhaustible supply of attention. She quipped, "Maybe I have attention surplus disorder. The easiest thing in the world for me is to pay attention." I want to come back to this later, but yes, as she said, throughout history, artists have drawn our attention to, say, the details of a human face and the subtlety of expression, as in the Mona Lisa, or to the expressive quality in a simple gesture, like the hand of one of Degas' ballerinas. They help us appreciate landscapes we might be so used to seeing that we don't notice them anymore. Think a field of poppies, or a Taoist painting of craggy mountains and trees. They invite us to look again at a vase of flowers or a bowl of fruit on a table, such as Monet's apples and grapes, or to marvel at the way sunlight comes in through a high window, something the Dutch masters were so fond of capturing. This is what Sontag means by a repertory of objects on which to lavish attention. All of these are details easily missed in everyday life, things we might take for granted. But the artist says, look at how absurdly beautiful these flowers are. Who knows why they have to be so beautiful? And they're just going to fade away and begin to droop in a matter of days. What is this life? While science strives to find what is generally true about, say, women, art looks for what is true about this woman named Lisa. Although that's kind of a weird example because I think we all know that more research is needed on women's health, but I digress. When it comes to paying close attention to the natural world and finding what is true about this particular tree or flower, the poets Mary Oliver and David Whyte come to mind. David Whyte, for his part, began his career working as a naturalist guide in the Galapagos Islands, where the wildlife was not afraid of humans. He would come up almost face to face with a hawk sitting on a branch, and it wouldn't move or fly away, so he was able to look directly in its eyes. As an expert in the field, he knew the Latin names of everything he saw, but he found that this acted as a sort of veil over the essence of what was there. Over time, he started paying attention more deeply. Each day, he experienced animals and birds dying. But it wasn't just that he would come across, say, a dead seal on the beach. It was a particular seal that he'd come to know for its distinct personality and characteristics, little quirks that he says made it as different from the other seals as we are from one another. Or he'd come across a deceased land iguana that he recognized for its unique personality. By paying such close attention to these creatures, not just as specimens of a species, but as individuals with their own habits and idiosyncrasies, he was able to really see them for the first time. One has to imagine that he grew to care about them in a different way as well. His time on the Galapagos Islands was the beginning of his life as a poet. In fact, the imagery of ocean meeting land eventually led to his poignant conception of our lives as a conversation with the world. Mary Oliver took a slightly different path to becoming a poet, but she too credited the cultivation of attention to the natural world as the impetus for her lifelong vocation. Instead of traveling to the Galapagos Islands, she encountered the drama and the wisdom of nature right in her backyard. She famously went on daily solitary walks in the woods near her home in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And if you've read any of her poems, you know that they are essentially odes to nature. In her essay, Upstream, she describes a time when she, as a child, accidentally walked up a river instead of down, thereby getting farther and farther away from her parents, who eventually reported her as missing. Little Mary didn't realize she was missing, though. She writes, "If this was lost, let us be lost always." She was completely enamored with the spring flowers and ferns, walking sometimes in the water and sometimes along the bank. "My heart opened and opened again," she writes. She begins the essay with an observation similar to David Whyte's. "One tree is like another tree, but not too much. One tulip is like the next tulip, but not altogether." Then the very last line reads, "Attention is the beginning of devotion." I like this idea of attention almost alchemizing into love, care, and devotion so powerfully that it could actually alter the course of someone's life. I remember being slightly perturbed as a child by the premise of the Disney movie Beauty and the Beast. I mean, I loved that movie. I watched it countless times. But every time I heard the narrator say, "For who could ever learn to love a beast?" I remember thinking, yeah, how could anybody ever learn to love anybody? Either you love or you don't. It doesn't seem like something you could learn to do. But now I understand that we can learn to pay attention, to notice, to give it time, to not just see what we expect to see or are prejudiced to see, but to allow what is there to present itself to us in all its strange and delightful mannerisms, to keep looking for longer than we're used to. And that as we do, the clouds of indifference begin to part, and love rises. Now, I know what you're thinking. Just kidding, I have no idea. But one might be wondering at this point how staring at a vase of peonies or at a Galapagos Island fur seal is going to help us manage to read a whole book, or whatever your holy grail of having a restored attention span is. Well, I'm going to let Simone Weil take this one. If you're familiar with Simone Weil, you probably could have guessed that her name was going to come up at some point in this episode. If you're not familiar, Simone Weil was a French philosopher, mystic, and social activist who lived during the first few decades of the 20th century. Born in Paris to a secular Jewish family in 1909, Simone was an almost preternaturally sincere child in her intellectual curiosity. At the age of 5, she and her brother began corresponding with French soldiers fighting on the front lines who had no living families and were surviving on meager rations. Little Simone and André sent the soldiers their own sugar and chocolate. In fact, Simone refused to eat sugar for as long as the soldiers at the front were unable to get it. An early example of Simone's awareness of her own privilege existing alongside the misfortune of others. This self-sacrificing desire for justice was a theme throughout her life and even her death. She was a student and eventually a teacher of philosophy, but she was not content to confine her philosophy to the classroom. While working as a teacher in Le Puy during the Depression years, she joined the cause of the working class, marching in their picket lines, rolling up her sleeves to take part in the pick and shovel work of the unemployed, and refusing to eat more than the rations of those on relief, distributing her surplus to those in need. Eventually, she left her teaching post and took a job at the Renault auto plant, the better to understand the plight of the working class. For a short while, she even moved to Spain to join the cause of the Loyalists during the Spanish Civil War. For Simone Weil, this was the holy grail of attention: the ability and the capacity to pay deep and close attention to the suffering of our fellow man. Not to look away from affliction, or pretend it doesn't exist, or to see nothing but our preconceived notions and judgments about the less fortunate among us, but to selflessly look and listen, uncomfortable as it may be. This love for our neighbor, especially the less fortunate ones, was something that Simone Weil thought that the Christian religion got right. In fact, she felt that Christianity got a lot of things right. Although she never entered the church despite seriously considering doing so for years, she had a distinctly Christian worldview. But it wasn't a worldview that denied the validity and truth of other religions. She was also very attracted to ideas found in Buddhism and Hinduism, for example. Simone Weil did not shrink from paradox, the ability to hold two seemingly opposing truths up side by side. One of my favorites of hers is as follows: there is a God. There is no God. Where's the problem? I am quite sure there is a God, in the sense that I am sure my love is no illusion. I am quite sure there is no God, in the sense that I am sure there is nothing which resembles what I can conceive when I say that word. It's because of this, what I would call rigorous open-mindedness, that her writing holds water far beyond the limits of organized religion, despite her use of religious language like God, faith, and prayer. In fact, she thought that prayer and attention were almost the same thing, that giving your full attention to a prayer is what makes it prayer, and that attention itself, taken to its highest degree, is a form of prayer. She felt strongly that the purpose of education was to develop the powers of attention, and that no genuine effort of attention was ever wasted. So, let's say you spend an hour focusing all of your attention on trying to solve a math problem, and at the end of the hour, you are no closer to solving it than you were at the beginning. You might think you have made zero progress, but Simone Weil would beg to differ. She would argue that you have been making progress each minute of that hour, but in another, more mysterious dimension. Of this phenomenon, she writes, "Without our knowing it or feeling it, this apparently barren effort has brought more light into the soul." She goes on, "Even if our efforts of attention seem for years to be producing no result, one day, a light that is in exact proportion to them will flood the soul. Every effort adds a little gold to a treasure no power on earth can take away. This has got to be the most compelling case for making the effort to develop our powers of attention. Not to do it because it will make us smarter or better or more interesting, but because it adds richness to our inner lives. We don't do it because it will make us more valuable. We do it because it will help us value life more. It's important to note that when Simone Weil uses the word effort, she does not have in mind the sort of concentration that would have you hold your breath, knit your eyebrows, and grit your teeth. She called paying attention a negative effort, one in which you must empty yourself of yourself and suspend your thought, leaving it detached and empty, ready to be penetrated by the object. Contrary to popular belief, she thought, willpower and muscular effort have no place in study because the intelligence is led by desire, the desire to increase one's grasp of truth. In other words, we learn what we want to learn, not what we are taught, or try to force ourselves to learn. In fact, if we become tired and attention just is not happening, she says it's better to take a break and seek relaxation. Pretty standard advice, but listen to what she says next. She says, we have to press on and loosen up alternately, just as we breathe in and out. I love this idea of paying attention as breathing, not as a muscle we need to strengthen or a span we need to lengthen, but as a natural, completely personal rhythm, and a vital one at that. The goal is not to take one long in-breath for the rest of your life, but on the other hand, if it's been a while since you've truly paid attention to something, some part of you may be desperate for air. I think of the ability to pay attention as a skill, almost like singing. A singer must learn where notes live in their bodies. They can't just look at a keyboard and play middle C. They have to get the feel for where a note is. They have to imagine what it will sound like, what it will feel like, and then trust themselves to produce it. Some days it comes easily, the most natural thing in the world. Some days, each note must be coaxed out of hiding like a timid animal. But the more practice they have, the more skilled they are at doing this. As much as we would like to be able to flip a switch and pay attention whenever we so choose, I think we've probably all discovered by now that it is much more elusive than that. It's more like an art form that requires a lot of practice and a lot of patience. This is why I'm not so sure that Susan Sontag was simply born with more attention than most people. She obviously made a habit of paying attention, and by doing so, she probably got really good at it. So how does one practice paying attention? If we can't reach out and play middle C, and we can't power through our physical and mental exhaustion by furrowing our brow, how do we do it? How do we find it? Where does attention live in the body? What does it feel like? In order to locate it, I personally find it helpful to look at the etymological background of the word. Attention comes from the Latin ad tendere, which means to stretch towards. You can imagine stretching toward a book, or a math problem, or a painting in a museum. You can even stretch toward a starry sky or a praying mantis. In other words, things that don't need to be solved or learned per se. You can stretch towards something that doesn't exist yet, as in a creative endeavor. You can passively listen to music, or you can mentally stretch toward it. You can sit back and expect the movie to spoon-feed the plot to you, or you can stretch toward what is being said and shown, as well as what is not being said or shown. You can wait in anguish for the meeting to be over, or you can stretch toward what is happening around you, which Simone Weil would say is not a wasted effort, even if you consider the meeting itself to be a waste of time. This is also where we get the word attend, as in attend to me, or listen to me. The bridal attendants, in theory, do not sit back in their own minds and daydream, but actively stretch toward the bride, anticipating her needs and responding to her requests. If we tend a garden, or a wound, or animals, or our children or parents, we do more than simply feed, clothe, bathe, water, etc. Tending implies a sensitivity to these living beings and their needs. It's a kind of deep listening. Also related is the word tendril. A tendril is a slender, thread-like appendage of a climbing plant, often growing in a spiral form, that stretches out and twines around any suitable support. A tendril is, well, tender, not tough. It is vulnerable, yet full of vitality. It is youthful. This is how I envision my attention, as a little green tendril stretching outward, bobbing in the air, and hoping to clasp onto something I don't know yet, or can't quite see yet, or cannot yet comprehend. There's something slightly precarious yet thrilling about paying attention. Judging by the many bright-eyed octogenarians I've met in my life, I'm convinced that shooting out little tendrils of attention every day is what keeps us young and vibrant. This is the real fountain of youth. And it's not just because you have successfully learned something new, thereby making you a smarter and more interesting person. It's because you have successfully directed your very life force outward, beyond what you currently understand to be yourself. Thinking of attention as stretching towards something may save us from our slump into passive consumerism, because rather than asking ourselves, is this article or reel or book or movie or person doing a good enough job of holding my attention? We instead ask ourselves, is this something I would like to stretch toward? And am I able to do so right now? When we talk about our dwindling attention spans, I'm not sure it's attention we're really talking about. Not in the sense we've been discussing here anyway. I don't think a highly stimulating 10-second video requires us to stretch toward it at all. I think it takes on the full responsibility of amusing us. I want to close today by letting you in on a little method I've devised to help me find my way back to a state of attention when my brain feels like a snow globe of information confetti. It's sort of like stop, drop, and roll, but for when your brain is on fire. Step 1, stop moving. No fidgeting. Breathing is okay. But try to make sure your body is as silent as possible. Step 2, stop talking. Literally, for sure, but also do your best to quiet the chatter in your mind. This may take a little while, but when you're ready, step 3, listen. Notice how many different sounds you can hear right now. A clock ticking, birds chirping, planes flying overhead, unidentified low-level hums, everything. Then the final step, step 4, stretch toward. Mentally stretch toward all these sounds, as well as what you can see and smell and feel, remaining still and as empty of yourself as you can, shooting those tendrils outward, letting them bob up and down in the air. If you're on a very strict schedule, you might have to set a timer for 2 or 3 minutes. But this exercise isn't about how long you can pay attention. It's not like a staring contest with yourself. In fact, as you do this, you might begin to sense another dimension altogether. Not a length of time, but a vertical dimension. As you mentally stretch towards something, your attention deepens. I sometimes wonder if, instead of measuring attention in spans, we should start measuring it in fathoms. How would we even do that? Something to ponder. Support for First Creatures comes from our listeners. Thank you to everyone who has signed up for monthly donations, including our newest supporters, Daniel Song and Rod Wilkin. To learn more about First Creatures and to find out how you can support the podcast, visit firstcreatures.com. Thanks for listening.